Hi class, welcome to Pilgrims, Puritans, and Cavaliers. We're going to be talking about William Bradford, John Winthrop, and Thomas Morton. This week, we'll be focusing on Bradford and Morton. Part 1, a little bit of background and more about William Bradford and of Plymouth Plantation. To begin with, England's state church was in fact a state church, which meant that it was mandatory for everybody to attend. There was no freedom to choose what a person believed or how he or she could worship. At the time the Pilgrim Fathers were living in England, there was only one approved church, and this, of course, was historically true of previous ages as well. Basically, the rule was this: if the English ruler were Protestant, all people of the realm were required to follow the Protestant's beliefs, and if he were Catholic, everyone was required to be Catholic. So this is what was termed a state church. Religious persecution is the major reason that is given when we try to account for the reasons or the major reasons the Pilgrims and the Puritans left England. The reigning ruler appointed the archbishop, and the archbishop in turn determined the official creeds. Anyone who objected to these creeds could be questioned, thrown into prison, arrested, and if they refused to give up their personal beliefs, they could be tortured in an effort to make them agree with the state church. And if they still refused, they could be executed. So many people were imprisoned, tortured, and put to death. Many were hanged, some were quartered, and some were burned at the stake. This was a violent time. This, of course, had its precedents in other places in Europe, notably the Spanish Inquisition, and in the Golden Age of Spain, was responsible for basically systematically eliminating not just people who would not convert to Catholicism, but anyone who, especially of different faith traditions such as Muslim or Islam, as well as Jews. Well, here's an example of what it meant to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Essentially, to be hanged is simply to be, well, you already know what hanged is, but to be drawn and quartered is simply to tie all four limbs to 4 different horses, and then the 4 different horses were galloped off in the points of the compass, so you were literally pulled apart. And you can see some of the remains there. It was a very gory and grisly way to die. Queen Mary, of course, was a Catholic queen, and of course under her temporary reign, there was a lot of persecution of Protestants. All right, so this was the context into which our little battle between the Puritans and the Cavaliers, or the Separatists and the Cavaliers, began. So let's define our terms a little bit. So there were 2 major groups of believers who disagreed with the beliefs and practices of the Church of England. One, of course, was the Puritans, who wanted to stay in the church, but they hoped to change its forms of worship or to purify it. The other group did not believe that this state church could be changed, so they were called the Separatists. They wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. So, the Separatists are also known as the Pilgrims, who by William Bradford. They are the ones that landed at Plymouth Rock, which is approximately 30 miles south of the present-day Boston, 13 years after Jamestown. It was small, but the survivors persevered. Now, during the 1620s, there were some other settlers who migrated to Massachusetts after the Pilgrims, but they were small and relatively insignificant. There were also advance parties for the Puritans who came in the years 1628 and 1629. Another way for you to remember the Separatists is this was the group of dissenters who went and lived in Holland for a time. before they actually embarked on the Mayflower. Winthrop. John Winthrop was the leader of the later settlers, the Puritans, who came over in 1630. Winthrop's fleet landed in Salem, Massachusetts in 1630, with the first mass exodus of Puritans from England. So in that first group of settlers in 1630, there were 1,000 people, and 200 died that winter. And some returned to England. Now, once again, just to remind you, the Puritans came over in 1632. They were the later group of settlers. The first group was the Pilgrims, the Separatists, led by William Bradford, to whom we will return in just a moment. So after John Winthrop landed in 1630, bringing along those 1,000 settlers, something very interesting happened in the next 10 years. 20,000 people, mostly from England and mostly of the Puritan philosophy, immigrated to Massachusetts to form Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was called the Great Migration, this period between 1630 and 1640. There was hardly any further migration into New England until after the Revolution. Virtually all growth of the colony after 1640 was by natural reproduction. This, of course, is a claim to fame for various historical societies and genealogy societies, such as the John Winthrop Society. All right, so once again, to reinforce and clarify, there were two major landings when we're talking about the Anglos who settled the New England colonies. The first, of course, was in 1620 with William Bradford, who led the small group of Pilgrim separatists. About 35 out of the passengers on the Mayflower were such. And this is pictures, of course, that's a little cartoon, William Bradford, and this is the Mayflower. And the second picture depicts the Arbella, which was the ship aboard which John Winthrop delivered his famous speech, a model of Christian charity. Once again, a geographical location. So we have Massachusetts and Boston, north of Plymouth. As I said, this is about 20 miles altogether, not very far at all. And then, of course, that Massachusetts Bay is the area that the later group, John Winthrop's crowd, settled, whereas the Pilgrims came down here by way of Massachusetts Bay and landed at Plymouth Rock. You can actually go to Plymouth at this time. There is a plantation there, staffed by live actors who play and dress genuinely and actually fish and clean the fish and speak in accents. It's quite the place. Here are some famous depictions of the landing at Plymouth Rock. So now we're going to talk about William Bradford, who was the leader of the Pilgrim separatists. He was born in 1590 in Yorkshire. He became a regular attender as he grew, or, he was around 20. He became a regular attender quite young, technically 12 years old. And he came under the influence of a particular preacher by the name of William Brewster. And this particular group of people were called the Scrooby Separatist Congregation. These separatists left England in 1608 to settle Holland. Now, William Bradford followed them. Or he did not come over with them in 1608. He joined them a year later. And in 1630, he married his first wife, Dorothy May. Now, there is some interesting stories about Dorothy May, which, of course, no one really pays much attention to except avid history buffs. But one of the stories was that she supposedly had a dramatic death just as the Mayflower was embarking to sail to the New World, and people sort of assumed that she'd committed suicide. So, in 1620, that is, of course, the death of Dorothy May, but more importantly, when the Pilgrims left from Holland to go to Plymouth. In 1621, a year later after they landed, John Carver, the first governor, died. William Bradford was elected, and except for 5 years, he remained governor of Plymouth Plantation for the rest of his life. Now, of course, William Bradford wrote other things besides of Plymouth Plantation. Primarily the things that he wrote were chronicles, histories, and personal accounts. In 1623, William Bradford married his second wife, and in 1630 he began the writings that eventually became a Plymouth Plantation. Now, very briefly, you can understand why he may have started this work in 1630. And of course, in 1650, he stopped writing it, but he didn't really go past the year 1646. But he did, in fact, add a current list of the passengers and their status in the year 1650. Now, the motivation behind of Plymouth Plantation was certainly to separate, ironically, to separate and to distinguish his group from that of the Puritans, especially given that the Puritans by far outnumbered the Pilgrims and, of course, became very well, of course, they were separated by a geographically short distance, and over time, their family trees intertwined. All right, so let's talk more about what we read. Of Plymouth Plantation was written in reported events between 1630 and 1646. It wasn't published until the 19th century, 1856. And one of its chief characteristics is the use of typology. Now, typology is something we will define more in depth when we get to Edward Taylor. However, it is more or less an interpretive strategy whereby the history of Plymouth, well, in fact, the history of any particular place, parallels an Old Testament history. Now, it wasn't so much that Plymouth Plantation was a chronicle, a strict historical account, but it was an attempt to interpret God's design for his saints. Now, the easiest way to understand the interpretive approach of Bradford is to see how he saw the world, and he saw the world as an open book upon whose pages God had written, and the events of history God controlled. And our job was to interpret those pages, the events of human life, as a sign or a indication of God's works and his future for us. So it was to interpret God's book of life. So other features of this particular work was that Bradford was confused sometimes in dealing with the ambiguity of divine providence, which basically means theodicy, or the study of evil, and why bad things happen to good people and why bad people sometimes prospered. In keeping with the later 1640 Bay Psalm book, Bradford did adopt the tone of humility and a use of a plain style. Now, I want you to understand, of course, that in both of Plymouth Plantation and later in A Model of Christian Charity, there are two major themes, or one major theme that unites them, and that is the attempt to build a community. And basically that community, through Bradford's eyes, was a group of faithful and charitable citizens struggling against outside forces and prevailing with God's providence. So in the beginning pages of that particular work, you may have noticed that there was a particular seaman who was very, very salty, a little more salty than usual. And he was, of course, rude and crude and vulgar. And then when he comes down with a fatal illness, of course, Bradford sees that as a curse from God. The other thing was their attitude, the Pilgrims' attitude towards the New World and towards the indigenous peoples. And early on in the passages that we read for today, the savages were kind, but they were as ready to fill their sides full of arrows as not. So the crew of the Mayflower, out of 101 people, only 35 were actually separatists. Now, 6 or 7 of these faithful nursed the Pilgrims and crew during the starving time, showing Christian love. A pact of friendly alliance with Samoset and Squanto, once they did land, was struck. And so the relations between Bradford's people and the natives was slightly different from that of course, John Smith's. The land, and by the way, Squanto was considered by Bradford the special instrument of God until he died. Now, the other aspect of community is that there was, in fact, an effort to parcel the land according to a familial system and against strict communism, i.e., the whole community, neighbors alike holding the same amount. In other words, there was a system of distribution according to family ties. So people began, or at least continued, and modified somewhat the practice of private property began in England. Now, keep in mind that it was, of course, difficult to obtain land and keep land, and here it was difficult for different reasons, but certainly your status, your line, your bloodline didn't count. So Thomas Morton was a neighbor, and again, he was, in this theme of community, an outsider. He was, in fact, a symbol of the Cavalier, a supporter of the king and the Anglican Church. He was an upper-class soldier. And, of course, he was a sign of the corruption of the old world. Now, one last thing about the community, and, of course, in support of our next slide, is that the idea that the Massachusetts Bay Settlement in 1630 added not just population, but success to the colonies, the prosperity and the wealth and the cultivation of land and the conquest over the Native Americans led to a state whereby people started to disperse from their originally tight-knit communities in order to seek out more land and more wealth. And this, of course, led to a kind of dissolution that Bradford decried, and of course later on Michael Wigglesworth warned against. Here's a picture of Plymouth Plantation in the year 2003. This is when I took a study tour along with Dr. Mark Eaton. And of course, this is a yeoman telling a student from APU that William Bradford is not about, because here I am. I kept on asking, where's William Bradford and where are all the children? But this particular yeoman, who spoke with an accent, he said he had heard about the parties that Thomas Morton had with those savages. All right, we'll read more about Thomas Morton and the savages on Friday. Oh, yes. Okay, here's another actor. No, this is not the same guy, believe it or not. This crewman aboard the Mayflower called me good wife, and which I did not like. And one of the things, of course, I asked him is, okay, where are all the children? I was really mean because, of course, you know, the children weren't there because of child, well, I suppose they could have been homeschooled, but they had to be in school, so they couldn't pull them out of school to act at the Plymouth colony. So he made up this story, something to the effect of, well, why do you want kids anyway? They just mule about and throw up all the time. Anyway, it was a good time. So this, of course, this replica of the Mayflower, staffed with real live pilgrims and salty seamen, is very close to the actual rock. And that's it for today. Bye.